Welcome everybody to your review lecture video on Charles Dickens' Great Expectations. We're going to start with style, we're going to move on to content. That's your intro. Dickensian style. I should say, we're skipping over biographical details. Charles Dickens is such a cult figure, and was such a cult figure in his day, that if you want to know more about his personal background, his history, and how that informed his writing, it is easy peasy for you to find that information on the internet or in the library, or in any of the number of biopics that have been done on him. As a matter of fact, there's quite a good biopic about Charles Dickens, and particularly about Great Expectations, that was done a little while ago. I can't remember the title of it off the top of my head, but I will put it in the comments on this video. That would be a good place to start if you're interested in learning more about Dickens the man. But Dickensian style. Every now and then, literary critics decide that one author's style is so unique, so distinctive, and so particular to themselves that you don't really see this thing anywhere else, and so it gets its own term. In the Victorian period, novels were generally participating in one or more of the modes that we've already discussed. Realism, a lingering or renovated kind of romanticism, in some cases a kind of proto-modernism, as with Oscar Wilde, many others. Charles Dickens' novels, taken as a collective, encompass all of those stylistic elements. There are moments when they're highly realistic and pared down and gritty and precise, and then there are times when he's really capitalizing on the kind of stock and trade of capital R romantic norms or tropes. You see plenty of that in Great Expectations, the opening scene especially. At other times, Dickens really does seem, especially in his late career, to dig into some of the hallmarks of a pre-modernism. But in general, his unique flavor and approach, that the combination of gestures and techniques that he uses are so completely their own that he produced a new coinage, Dickensian. Now, just what Dickensian style is matter of some debate, and you can read all kinds of articles online or in the library discussing the ins and outs of it, and what it is or what it was, and whether its use and meaning have changed. But in this video, I'd like to very quickly outline a few of the hallmarks of a Charles Dickens novel, some of those kind of stylistic, classic Dickens things. And from there, I'd like to zero in on a particular element that's on high display, I should say, in our text for this week, Great Expectations, and that is social criticism. In this text, specifically, a social criticism of class. So, Dickens wrote a lot of really long novels. Great Expectations is kind of middling size for Dickens. He has some comparatively slim volumes like Barnaby Rudge or A Tale of Two Cities, but he has some doorstops like Bleak House or David Copperfield. Whether the story is short or long, something that's really common for Dickens is that his stories tend to have like a cast of thousands. There are just characters on characters on characters. And some of them may only be in the novel for one chapter, or, maybe they'll be in there for a brief space of time, and then, oh, that guy that we forgot about, he'll crop up kind of, or she will crop up towards the end of the plot. But the minor characters in his stories, of which there are many, tend to be a bit one-dimensional. Like, they're really not fully fleshed out, psychically complicated characters. They're just sort of caricatures. They're these figures that populate and give color to scenes and different, environments or plot segments of the main story. They might often serve for comic effect or to kind of quickly and vividly make a witty point, a witty sort of observational point that Dickens wants to make that will speak to the center plot as it's progressing. A good example from Great Expectations would be the Pocket household, when Pip first visits the Pocket household, and we have this protracted dinner scene where, you know, the mother is really not doing a very good job at handling the baby because she's, you know, far too aristocratic to be doing that kind of menial labor, and the older children are kind of like fumblingly trying to take care of the smaller children, and the servants are basically running the show because the parents are sort of well-intended but incompetent. The scene is sketched in very sort of broad, dark, colorful strokes to just give you this vivid impression that will contribute to the discussion of class and character that's building in a more sophisticated way throughout the novel, particularly as seen and experienced by the main character, Pip, and some of the other main characters like Estella, Miss Havisham, Joe. So yeah, characters in the foreground of a Charles Dickens novel tend to be drawn vividly and in a sometimes exaggerated fashion, like caricatures, I said, whether for comic or dark, or, I mean, it could be for any number of different kinds of effect. But what makes a really interesting contrast that is just so typical of a Dickens novel is that the backgrounds, the settings, the environments, the description of social moment or industry or nature, the backgrounds tend to be much more realistically and richly sketched. They can be almost punctilious in their level of detail, atmospheric, cinematic even. So, and that combination creates this really, it's difficult to describe, but it creates this really unique juxtaposition in the readerly experience of the novel, between our experience of the quality that the characters have, especially the minor characters, that caricatured, sort of exaggerated, thin, not too realistic, but definitely emotionally, like, quickly recognizable effect, and the backgrounds or environments, which can be so affecting and so profound and so nuanced. And then somewhere in between those layers will be your core cast of main characters who tend to be more realistic, more three-dimensional, but often kind of still alleviated at moments, lightened at moments, you know, with their own sort of comic or absurd aspects, and then darkened and enriched at moments with these incredibly emotionally sophisticated monologues, you know, like when Pip talks about a child's sense of justice and how, you know, the child's hobby horse stands as many hands high as an adult's hunting horse. You know, his world is proportional to him. That is the back and forth, the sort of emotional vacillation that characterizes a Dickensian novel. And many people have tried, I think, since Dickens to recreate those patterns, but nobody does it like Dickens. Nobody really brings it to bear effectively the way that he did. Themes of social justice or social criticism are a defining feature of Dickens' entire career. I'm not sure he ever wrote a novel that didn't in some way take the condition of England to task. He had many, I don't want to call them pet causes because that's trivializing, but he had many causes that were dear to his heart as a professional in adult life. Dickens was an outrageously famous man. He was incredibly wealthy. His work was so popular in his time that it really made him a public figure of significant influence. And in that capacity, he really used his platform as a champion of charitable causes, a social crusader, someone who spoke out at every level where he could get anyone to listen to him. as an advocate for things like children's right to education, as somebody who himself had experienced child labor when he was growing up. He was an advocate for, I believe, sort of havens and egress strategies and rehabilitation resources for women who, I guess what at the time would have been described as fallen women, but sex workers essentially. He had many causes that were really important to him. He worked for an extended period of time as a court reporter, just trying to kind of, get his handle in life when he was a young man, right? This was before he really caught fire as a novelist, but he made his start as a writer, as a court reporter, and that really had an influence not only on his writing in later life, but also on his vision of justice and some of the problems that were plaguing ordinary British people during the Victorian period. One place in our novel here, Great Expectations, where you can kind of see that coming to the fore is in his treatment of the character Magwitch, this convict that Pip meets in the very beginning, and how his dealing with Magwitch takes its shape over the course of the whole novel. One last sort of hallmark of Dickensian novels that I'd like to mention, and I'm going to track you through some passages or quotes that illustrate this point, is that typical in a Dickens novel are these elaborate, almost rhapsodic paragraphs or passages that heap repetition on repetition to intensify a point or an effect, to make a certain thing either very memorable or at least very impactful, and usually both. That is a classic Dickens thing to do. You'll see it happen in almost any novel by him that you read, and you know it when it's happening. You'll hear that paragraph and you go, oh yeah, that's him doing the thing. I've got a few different examples queued up here from novels that were written across Dickens' career. I'm going to read through them to give you a sense of them, and hopefully these passages will also kind of illustrate or draw attention to some of the other points that I've made so far, and then we will transition into some sort of focused attention on Great Expectations itself. So these are these really repetitious paragraphs that just heap emphasis on a moment and really, really bring up the drama or bring up an ironic effect or emphasize a political trenchantness in what he has to say. This first passage is from one of Dickens' very early novels called Oliver Twist, which was about an orphan who asked for more from life, from the world. In this scene, what's happening is that Oliver has sort of been framed in a pickpocketing incident. And right now he's sort of, running wild with a band of orphans who make their living by pickpocketing. And he has been mistaken for having pickpocketed this gentleman. And the gentleman, who thinks that Oliver has taken something from him, yells, "Stop, thief!" And of course that has its effect because everybody instantly hears, "Stop, thief!" And so this is the passage. But the old gentleman was not the only person who raised the hue and cry. The Dodger and Master Bates, unwilling to attract public attention by running down the open street, these are the other two boys that were skulking around with Oliver, these two boys, unwilling to attract public attention by running down the open street, had merely retired into the very first doorway round the corner, and they no sooner heard the cry and saw Oliver running than, guessing exactly how the matter stood, they issued forth with a great promptitude, shouting, "Stop, thief!" too, and joined in the pursuit like good citizens. Although Oliver had been brought up by philosophers, he was not theoretically acquainted with the beautiful axiom that self-preservation is the first law of nature. If he had been, perhaps he would have been prepared for this. Not being prepared, however, it alarmed him the more, so he went like the wind with the old gentleman and the two boys roaring and shouting behind him, "Stop thief! Stop thief!" There is a magic in the sound. The tradesman leaves his counter and the carman his wagon. The butcher throws down his tray, the baker his basket, the milkman his pail, the errand boy his parcels, the schoolboy his marbles, the pavior his pickaxe, the child his battledore. Away they run, pell-mell, helter-skelter, slap-dash, tearing, yelling, screaming, knocking down the passengers as they turn round the corners, rousing up the dogs and astonishing the fowls. The streets and squares and courts re-echo the sound. Stop thief! Stop thief! The cry is taken up by 100 voices, and the crowd accumulate at every turning. Away they fly, splashing through the mud and rattling along the pavements. Up go the windows, outrun the people, onward bear the mob, a whole audience desert, Punch in the very thickest of the plot. The whole audience desert Punch, which is like a puppet show, in the very thickest of the plot. And join the rushing throng, swell the shout, lend fresh vigor to the cry, "Stop thief! Stop thief! Stop thief! Stop thief!" There is a passion for hunting something deeply implanted in the human breast. One wretched, breathless child panting with exhaustion. Terror in his looks, agony in his eyes, large drops of perspiration streaming down his face, strains every nerve to make head upon his pursuers, and as they follow on his track and gain upon him every instant, they hail his decreasing strength with joy. "Stop thief! Aye, stop him, for God's sake, were it only in mercy." That is a classic Dickens passage where repetition is used partly for comic effect, partly the comedy is ironic because this is a really dark situation, and then ultimately at the twist to drive home a point. There is a passion for hunting something deeply implanted in the human breast. Even if it's just a wretched orphan who may or may not have stolen a handkerchief. Aye, stop him, for God's sake, were it only in mercy. Another of Dickens' novels, later in his career, in the section of Dickens' career that some people describe as angry Dickens, where he's that much further on in his career and he's been crusading for social reform for so long that he's become a bit disillusioned and his bitterness shows in some of his writing. This novel is called A Bleak House, and the whole thing is about what's called Chancery Court, or petty law court, and how cases and the people who bring the cases and all the people who are entangled with those people who bring the cases can get swallowed up in the muck and mire and red tape of this antiquated, soulless system that just wastes people's whole lives in stacks and stacks of paper. Dickens sort of foreshadows his themes in the opening chapter of this novel by painting out the scene of the start of the book, which takes place in London, on a really murky, foggy, muddy, wet, gross day where the pollution seems really prominent in the atmosphere. And Dickens just repeats those words, mud and fog, ad nauseum almost. So I'll read it here. London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. That would be the man in charge of Chancery Court. Implacable November weather. As much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus, 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. Smoke lowering down from the chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle, with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes. Gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs indistinguishable in mire. Horses, scarcely better, splashed to their very blinkers. Foot passengers jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper and losing their foothold at street corners, where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke, if ever this day broke, adding new deposits to the crust upon crust of mud, sticking at those points tenaciously to the pavement and accumulating at compound interest. Fog everywhere. Fog up the river where it flows among green eights and meadows. Fog down the river where it rolls defiled among tiers of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners wheezing by the firesides of their wards, fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper down in his close cabin, fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck, chance people on the bridges peeping over the parapets into a nether sky of fog, with fog all around them as if they were up in a balloon and hanging in the misty clouds. Gas looming through the fog in divers places in the streets, much as the sun may from the spongy fields be seen to loom by a husbandman and ploughboy. Most of the shops lighted 2 hours before their time, as the gas seems to know, for it has a haggard and unwilling look. The raw afternoon is rawest, and the dense fog is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest near that leaden-headed old obstruction, appropriate ornament for the threshold of a leaden-headed old corporation, Temple Bar. And hard by Temple Bar, in Lincoln's Inn Hall, at the very heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor in his High Court of Chancery. I'm about to tell you a story about court and the people who get lost in it, and I'm going to tell you that a man sits at the heart of that court, and that court sits at the heart of a great and dirty city, and everything about all of it is shrouded and mired in fog and mud, emblematic of the cruel, heartless red tape of this ancient, almost dinosaur, megalosaurus ancient institution that is Chancery Court. Like, that's how you start a novel. I've told you what this book is about. There's no excuses after this. One more, much, much shorter, also from Bleak House. This one comes after the death of a character that you can't help loving. There's a character called Joe in Bleak House who is another orphan. He makes his living by sweeping the streets and sort of begging for tips for making the city a little bit tidier. And he's illiterate. He cannot read, not one scratch, but he's a sweet, good-hearted, pure-spirited boy. He gets sick in this novel, and he dies in a really sad, pitiable way, preventable way. And just as they kind of realize that this boy is dead, the narrator, Charles Dickens, basically breaks the fourth wall, addresses the reader, and he names a number of specific readers that might be reading this book. And he says this. So we find out that Joe is dead, and the line is, "The light has come upon the dark, benighted way." As in, this ignorant, dark, benighted, backward boy who lived in poverty has reached the light. He's going to God. He's dead. The light has come upon the dark, benighted way. Dead. Dead, your majesty. Dead, my lords and gentlemen, dead right reverends and wrong reverends of every order, dead, men and women born with heavenly compassion in your hearts and dying thus around us every day. End of chapter. I mean, damn. He doesn't pull any punches. That is a barn burner of a speech. It's a few sentences long, takes up 2 or 3 lines of the screen. But as you've heard, it's got that same alliterative, rhythmic, repetitive, sort of heaping, driving, pounding, rhapsodic, emotionally trenchant quality to it. This is something we see basically in every Dickens ever. The example that I wanted to give you from Great Expectations, before we switch to part 2 of this video and focus on Great Expectations, is when Pip is going with Wemmick to the place where Herbert Pocket, or the pale young gentleman, lives, this sort of tenement called Barnard's Inn. They're going to meet Herbert Pocket for the first time. And this is Pip's very first ever trip to London, right? He's still really green. He doesn't know exactly where he is or what to expect from things. So he says, I had supposed that establishment to be an hotel, kept by Mr. Barnard, to which the Blue Boar in our town was a mere public house. Whereas I now found Barnard to be a disembodied spirit, or a fiction, and his inn the dingiest collection of shabby buildings ever squeezed together in a rank corner as a club for tomcats. We entered this haven through a wicket gate, and were disgorged by an introductory passage into a melancholy